The American love of cars is strong. From sports cars to muscle cars to JDM to supercars to whatever this is. And if you follow the car scene, then chances are you know of the Imported Vehicle Safety Compliance Act, more famously known as the 25-year rule. For simplicity's sake, the 25-year rule effectively bans individuals from importing new foreign market vehicles without first undertaking a costly and prolonged testing and federalization process to comply with American safety laws. What you may not know about the contentious law is how Mercedes, Porsche, Ferrari, and American domestic manufacturers and dealerships took the law into their own hands, convincing the federal government to change the car market forever, and many would say for the worse. Following the end of World War II, American servicemen found themselves stationed in Italy, France, England, and other European locations, having experienced many new things from food products and vehicles. When Americans started returning home, many decided that they loved their cars so much that they would often bring them back to the States as souvenirs of their time in Europe. Thousands of 1940s and 50s era European cars found their ways to the States, as prior to 1966, there were no federal safety standards for cars and highways. States did pass their own local laws, which often did broadly match similar legislation from other states, but there were no overarching federal regulations that would prevent the import of these European vehicles. While there were a good few years of the lax regulations, the first blow came in 1966 with the passing of the National Traffic and Motor Vehicle Safety Act. The Motor Vehicle Safety Act was implemented to curtail the spiraling increase in fatalities on U.S. roads, setting national standards for everything from seatbelt fitment to lighting, markings, barriers on the road, among many other things. While the act did play a hand in bringing down the vehicle fatality rate, it also for the first time imposed regulations on newly imported vehicles. European and Japanese vehicles were now deemed non-compliant and required modifications or risk running afoul of the federal government. During this era, the process of converting a vehicle to compliance with the law and approval for import was fairly straightforward, often requiring just simple body modifications and a stamp of approval from the Department of Transportation. And by the 1980s, tens of thousands of foreign-built vehicles were being privately imported each year. Americans had many reasons for wanting to import foreign vehicles into the US, ranging from speed to styling to cost. The rise in importation of vehicles coincided with the stagflation crisis of the 1970s, when energy prices skyrocketed in the US due to an oil embargo led by OPEC in response to the United States' support of Israel during the Yom Kippur War. The stagflation crisis pushed US Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker to substantially raise federal interest rates to 20% by March of 1980, and as a result, appreciated the dollar by nearly 50% against the yen and European currencies. Such a dramatic swing in value was too good of a deal to resist for savvy American buyers, skipping American dealers and purchasing directly from Europe. While everything these savvy buyers were doing was completely legal, the trade impact felt by manufacturers and their dealerships was immense. Mercedes began a public relations war in 1984 that warned consumers that savings from purchasing a gray market vehicle could be erased by bad actors, conversion shops failing to bring the vehicles into compliance, creating additional expenses and headaches for the purchaser. Mercedes itself conducted a test of the gray market, purchasing a reported 1985 500 SEL identified with airbags. When Mercedes received the vehicle, it was actually a 1984 model year with no airbags and a dangerously installed catalytic converter, haphazardly added to pass off as updated for compliance. While there is no evidence to necessarily disagree with Mercedes' findings, it is suspicious that in 1985 alone, 20,000 Mercedes entered the US via the gray market, representing an estimated $300 million loss for the company's American division. For Mercedes and other European manufacturers selling vehicles in the US, the status quo of the gray market was unacceptable. Despite Mercedes' findings in their war on the gray market, those same savvy consumers kept importing gray market vehicles, much to the displeasure of the automakers. So Mercedes did what any good corporation would do, lobbied the US federal government to effectively ban the gray market altogether. Mercedes reportedly spent millions in an all-out blitz campaign between 1985 and 86 to decapitate the gray market through federal regulation. Other foreign and domestic manufacturers, including Ferrari and Porsche, joined in solidarity among dealers who refused to warranty, service, and supply parts, or take gray market cars as trade-ins, depressing resale values. Those other manufacturers would also soon join Mercedes in lobbying efforts in what became 1988's aptly named Imported Vehicle Safety Compliance Act. The IVCSA established a more thorough system for the inspection and registration of foreign-built vehicles. now requiring state-certified registered importers to complete any necessary modifications rather than a private vehicle owner. Registered importers were only allowed to sell foreign market vehicles in the US if those vehicles fully met applicable safety and emission standards, in addition to new stringent certification procedures, including crash testing more than 10 examples of the vehicle. The IVCSA faced opposition from gray market importers in several states, forming their own group to lobby against the bill. Even US Representative Robert Walker of Pennsylvania questioned the legislation's intent, saying that its purpose was to help automakers rather than to protect the public. Walker even cited an enthusiast automotive magazine that dubbed it the Mercedes-Benz dealer's bill. Proponents of the legislation claim the bill keeps American drivers safe, while opponents note that it was largely automakers, not consumer advocates, lobbying in the law's favor. Additionally, they argue that if the law was passed as presented to help prevent deaths on US roads, that there were more effective ways to achieve the goal without punishing buyers. Notably, they bring up the whole situation arises in the first place because the US decided to implement its own unique set of safety regulations rather than adopt those set by the United Nations World Forum for Harmonization of Vehicle Regulations, which 60 other countries, including Europe, comply with, allowing the easy importing and exporting of vehicles between other countries, with the only two major exceptions being the United States and Canada. It has also been shown by means of crash testing that in many cases, cars built to UN standards are actually safer than those built for the US standards. Critics of the IVCSA would therefore like to see US standards brought into line with those found internationally. This, they argue, would make cars cheaper and safer for the buyer, whereas the current legislation only favors car dealers. There are two major exceptions to the IVCSA, with the most famous being the 25-year rule, which allows any vehicle 25 years or older to be legally imported into the US without needing to comply with the required safety standards. The exemption recognizes that those vehicles over 25 years old are considered classic and antiques, with it being seen as a compromise allowing collectors to still import vehicles while still protecting American consumers and/or manufacturers' bottom lines, depending on your view. Canada has a similar exemption set at 15 years without meeting safety guidelines, and opponents of the IVCSA indeed argue this exemption in both countries as protecting corporate interests, as if the vehicle is unsafe to drive in year 24 or 14, then it should be unsafe to drive in year 25 or 15. While the pushback to the law in the car community is strong to the general public who only buys RAV4s, Camrys, F-150s, and Silverados, the restrictions placed on niche Japanese and German vehicles is not on their radar, and as such there has been no movement in adjusting or overturn what many feel to be an unjust law. The other major exception, and the only real way for a private owner to bring a foreign vehicle into the US prior to 25 years old, is under the 1999 amendment known as the Show or Display Law. Show or Display allows cars of historic or technical significance with less than 500 examples to be legally imported into the US, and if their intention is to register them for public road use, they have to be driven less than 2,500 miles in any given year and will need an annual inspection to prove as such. What this amendment means in practice is that only roughly 65 specific vehicles can be imported to be shown off at car shows or to sit in the garage of a private collector and not be used as a daily driver. Show or display can be traced back to Bill Gates, or so the urban legend has it, when he imported a Porsche 959 sometime in 1987 or 88. Gates was apparently unaware that his Porsche did not comply with safety standards, and the 959 languished for years in a customs impound yard. According to importers, collectors, and the Department of Transportation workers in the mid-1990s, Gates directed his lobbying resources and cash towards getting his car out of impound and onto the road. In 1998, Representative Bill Tauzin of Louisiana, chair of the Subcommittee for Telecommunications, Trade, and Consumer Protections, introduced the Show or Display rule as part of a larger, broader bill, with it entering the Federal Register on July 14, 1999, and just 13 days later, it was the law of the land. Even with the laws regarding the importation of vehicles, many still attempt to import non-compliant vehicles, usually by either swapping the VIN plate or importing the vehicle to Canada, driving it over the border, and hoping that no one will notice. If you attempt to sidestep the rules, you're liable to have your car seized and even destroyed by the United States Customs and Border Protection. In recent years, the Department of Transportation and the customs authorities have taken to posting videos of such car crushings on YouTube. In two memorable instances, the agency can crush an illicit late model Land Rover Defender and a 2000 Mini Cooper. Personally, I'm not sure where I stand on the 25-year law. In my mind, it's very easy to see how manufacturers benefit from limiting purchasing options for consumers, forcing them to only a subset of options available internationally. On the other hand, especially in the 70s and 80s, as we discussed in my previous video on the Ford Pinto, safety standards were not of the highest quality or importance, so if Mercedes' claims regarding gray market vehicles are true, then buying only from reputable dealers would limit even further dangerous vehicles from possibly injuring countless lives. What I will say though is that European vehicles being produced right now are as safe, if not safer in some regards, than their American counterparts. And as opponents of the 25-year rule rightly point out, if the US adopted the UN rules, officially giving Americans more options, then that would likely decrease the cost of vehicles without questions about safety.